Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be unpacking a seriously profound narrative today from John chapter 9. It's the story of a man born blind. And honestly, to really get this, we need to set a stark, highly sensory tone right out of the gate. Try to imagine, just for a second, a life of total, unbroken darkness.
I mean, literally, he had never seen a sunrise. Not once. He had never seen the color of his mother's eyes. He hadn't even seen his own hands right in front of his face. He was born into complete and total darkness. And you know, the tragedy of this reality? It wasn't just physical. In his world, that kind of darkness came with a really harsh label. People didn't just see a blind man when they looked at him. They saw a giant question mark. They saw a punishment. He was literally known only by his condition.
Okay, let's dive right into this with part 1, Born into Total Darkness.
So let's look at the cultural setting here. This man, who actually has no name given in the text, which kind of tells you a lot right there, had been completely marginalized for decades. Now, the really interesting thing is the cultural definition of blindness back then. It wasn't just a medical reality, it was viewed as a spiritual verdict. People basically assumed physical ailments were direct punishments for sin. I mean, when Jesus' own disciples first saw him, they didn't ask what was wrong with his eyes. They immediately asked whose fault it was. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Think about how devastating that is. People talked about him instead of to him. He was just a walking sermon illustration for other people's theology.
Which brings us to part 2, purpose instead of punishment.
That stigma was his entire world, right up until the moment Jesus stopped walking. And Jesus' response? It must have completely stunned everyone standing there. This brilliantly illustrates the massive paradigm shift here. Society's view was simple. Blindness equaled blame and punishment. But Jesus' view? He completely dismantled a lifetime of societal blame in one sentence. He said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Right in front of the very people who had spent years judging him, Jesus publicly gave this man suffering a divine purpose. He flipped the script from punishment to purpose.
Then, Jesus does something super unconventional. He doesn't give a dramatic speech. He doesn't shout a public prayer. Step 1, he makes clay from dirt and saliva. Step 2, he anoints the man's eyes. And step 3, he commands him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. Let's slow down for a second and just think about the highly physical mechanics of this. Dirt, spit, and his own hands touching a man that society had spent decades avoiding. Imagine what that deliberate, unhurried human touch meant to an outcast. A guy who was probably only ever touched when a coin was tossed into his hand from a safe distance.
And that leads right into part 3, walking toward the unknown.
So the man is given an instruction to go and wash, and we really have to focus on the immense, practical faith required here. Think about his unrecorded struggles. He is totally blind, his face is covered with wet mud, and he has to walk through a crowded street based entirely on a stranger's word. Did he have help navigating? Did the crowd stare at the mud on his face? Did he stumble? Well, Scripture doesn't dwell on his journey, but we know his obedience is the core action. He didn't argue, he didn't demand proof first, he just chose to obey. It absolutely proves that faith isn't just some warm feeling. It is a profound, risk-taking action.
He reaches the pool. He kneels down. He washes the clay from his eyes. And Scripture simply says he came back seeing. 4 words that carry the weight of a lifetime, for the first time in his life. Just pause and imagine that awe-inspiring moment. For the very first time as a grown adult, he sees light. He sees the water rippling. He sees the shapes of human faces. He holds his own hands up and actually sees them. A world he only knew through sound and touch is suddenly, vibrantly visible.
But then, things take a crazy turn in part 4, the interrogation and rejection.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because you'd think a miracle of this magnitude would bring instant celebration, right? No way. It brought deep suspicion and obsessive rule-checking. Just look at this single day. Morning, he's healed at the pool of Siloam. Midday, his own neighbors are suspiciously questioning if it's even him. Afternoon, he's dragged in and interrogated by furious religious leaders over Sabbath rules. Late afternoon, his parents are brought in, and they totally deflect the questions because they're terrified of being expelled. And finally, evening, he is cast out of the synagogue entirely. He's pressured, isolated, and ultimately abandoned by his community just for receiving his sight.
Through all of this intense pressure, the religious leaders keep trying to force him to discredit Jesus. But he delivers this famous, disarmingly simple defense. Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. It is such a powerful statement. It shows us that absolute certainty doesn't require having every single complex theological question answered. He just held on to the undeniable truth of his own lived experience.
Which brings us to the most beautiful part of the story. Part 5. Seeing with the heart.
The story doesn't end in bitterness, and it doesn't end with a man healed but totally alone. Because when Jesus hears they cast him out, he actively goes looking for him. And this sets up a really profound comparison. You have the physical miracle, restoring his physical sight at the pool, but then you have the deeper miracle, restoring his dignity, giving him true recognition, and offering spiritual belonging. When Jesus reveals himself, the man says, "Lord, I believe," and worships him. First his eyes were opened, then his heart. That was the ultimate breakthrough.
Now this number, 2, represents exactly how many times society rejected this man. They rejected him once for being blind, and they rejected him a second time for seeing. It perfectly illustrates the sheer spiritual blindness of those religious leaders. I mean, the people who could physically see spent the whole chapter completely unable to recognize the truth, while the man who lived his whole life in darkness was the only one who truly saw clearly.
So what does this all mean for us? Let's look at some takeaways for today. Have you ever felt labeled by something you didn't choose? Have you ever felt misunderstood by people who cared way more about being right than about your actual well-being? This story shows us that your story isn't defined by those who doubt or dismiss it. Certainty is found in what God has done for you, in your actual breakthrough. Remember that darkness is often just the part right before the light. And maybe most importantly, God actively seeks you out when everyone else walks away.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative question. What miracle are you claiming today? If you are walking through something right now that feels like total, unexplained darkness, remember this man's journey. Your darkness is absolutely not the end of your story. It might just be the quiet obedience required before your eyes are opened. Keep exploring these truths, hold on to what you know is real, and never forget, you are being sought out by the light.